What is neuroticism, emotions, and feelings defined? In the study of psychology, neuroticism has been considered a fundamental personality trait. For example, in the Big Five approach to personality trait theory, individuals with high scores for neuroticism are more likely than average to be moody and to experience such feelings as anxiety, worry, fear, anger, frustration, envy, jealousy, guilt, depressed mood, and loneliness. Such people are thought to respond worse to stressors and are more likely to interpret ordinary situations, such as minor frustrations, as appearing hopelessly difficult. People with high scores on the neuroticism index are thought to be at risk of developing common mental disorders, mood disorders, anxiety disorders, and substance use disorders have been studied, and the sorts of symptoms traditionally referred to as neuroses. Definition: neuroticism is a trait in many models within personality theory, but there is significant disagreement on its definition. It is sometimes defined as a tendency for quick arousal when stimulated and slow relaxation from arousal, especially with regard to negative emotional arousal. Another definition focuses on emotional instability and negativity or maladjustment in contrast to emotional stability and positivity or good adjustment. It has also been defined in terms of lack of self-control, poor ability to manage psychological stress, and a tendency to complain. Various personality tests produce numerical scores, and these scores are mapped onto the concept of neuroticism in various ways, which has created some confusion in the scientific literature, especially with regard to subtraits or facets. Individuals who score low in neuroticism tend to be more emotionally stable and less reactive to stress. They tend to be calm, even-tempered, and less likely to feel tense or rattled. Although they are low in negative emotion, they are not necessarily high in positive emotion. Being high in scores of positive emotion is generally an element of the independent trait of extroversion. Neurotic extroverts, for example, would experience high levels of both positive and negative emotional states, a kind of emotional roller coaster. Measurement. Like other personality traits, neuroticism is typically viewed as a continuous dimension rather than a discrete state. The extent of neuroticism is generally assessed using self-report measures, although peer reports and third-party observation can also be used. Self-report measures are either lexical or based on statements. Deciding which measure of either type to use in research is determined by an assessment of psychometric properties and the time and space constraints of the study being undertaken. Lexical measures use individual adjectives that reflect neurotic traits such as anxiety, envy, jealousy, and moodiness, and are very space and time efficient for research purposes. Louis Goldberg, 1992, developed a 20-word measure as part of his 100-word Big Five markers. Saucer, 1994, developed a briefer 8-word measure as part of his 40-word mini markers. Thompson, 2008, systematically revised these measures to develop the International English Mini Markers, which has superior validity and reliability in populations both within and outside North America. Internal consistency reliability of the International English Mini Markers for the Neuroticism Emotional Stability Measure for native English speakers is reported as 0.84, and that for non-native English speakers is 0.77. Statement measures tend to comprise more words and hence consume more research instrument space than lexical measures. Respondents are asked the extent to which they, for example, remain calm under pressure or have frequent mood swings. While some statement-based measures of neuroticism have similarly acceptable psychometric properties in North American populations to lexical measures, their generally emic development makes them less suited to use in other populations. For instance, statements in colloquial North American English like feeling blue or being down in the dumps are sometimes hard for non-native English speakers to understand. Neuroticism has also been studied from the perspective of Gray's psychological theory of personality, using a scale that measures personality along two dimensions, the behavioral inhibition system (BIS) and the behavioral activation system (BAS). The BIS is thought to be related to sensitivity to punishment as well as avoidance motivation, while the BAS is thought to be related to sensitivity to reward as well as approach motivation. Neuroticism has been found to be positively correlated with the BIS scale and negatively correlated with the BAS scale. Neuroticism has been included as one of the four dimensions that comprise course self-evaluations. One's fundamental appraisal of oneself, along with locus of control, self-efficacy, and self-esteem. The concept of core self-evaluations was first examined by Judge Locke and Durham 1997, and since then evidence has been found to suggest these have the ability to predict several work outcomes, specifically job satisfaction and job performance. There is a risk of selection bias in surveys of neuroticism. A 2012 review of N-scores said that many studies used samples drawn from privileged and educated populations. Neuroticism is highly correlated with the startle reflex in response to fearful conditions and inversely correlated with it in response to disgusting or repulsive stimuli. This suggests that neuroticism may increase vigilance where evasive action is possible but promote emotional blunting when escape is not an option. A measure of the startle reflex can be used to predict the trait neuroticism with good accuracy, a fact that is thought by some to underlie the neurological basis of the trait. The startle reflex is a reflex in response to a loud noise that one typically has no control over, though anticipation can reduce the effect. The strength of the reflex as well as the time until the reflex ceases can be used to predict neuroticism. Mental disorder correlations. Questions used in many neuroticism scales overlap with instruments used to assess mental disorders like anxiety disorders, especially social anxiety disorder, and mood disorders, especially major depressive disorder, which can sometimes confound efforts to interpret N-scores and makes it difficult to determine whether each of neuroticism and the overlapping mental disorders might cause the other, or if both might stem from other cause. Correlations can be identified. A 2013 meta-analysis found that a wide range of clinical mental disorders are associated with elevated levels of neuroticism compared to levels in the general population. It found that high neuroticism is predictive for the development of anxiety disorders, major depressive disorder, psychosis, and schizophrenia, and is predictive but less so for substance use and nonspecific mental distress. These associations are smaller after adjustment for elevated baseline symptoms of the mental illnesses and psychiatric history. Neuroticism has also been found to be associated with older age. In 2007, Mroczek and Spiro found that among older men, upward trends in neuroticism over life as well as increased neuroticism overall both contributed to higher mortality rates. Mood disorders. Disorders associated with elevated neuroticism include mood disorders such as depression and bipolar disorder, anxiety disorders, eating disorders, schizophrenia, and schizoaffective disorder, dissociative identity disorder, and hypochondriasis. Mood disorders tend to have a much larger association with neuroticism than most other disorders. The 5 big studies have described children and adolescents with high neuroticism as anxious, vulnerable, tense, easily frightened, falling apart under stress, guilt-prone, moody, low in frustration tolerance, and insecure in relationships with others, which includes both traits concerning the prevalence of negative emotions as well as the response to these negative emotions. Neuroticism in adults similarly was found to be associated with the frequency of self-reported problems. These associations can vary with culture. For example, Adams found that among upper-middle-class American teenaged girls, neuroticism was associated with eating disorders and self-harm, but among Ghanaian teenaged girls, higher neuroticism was associated with magical thinking and extreme fear of enemies. Personality disorders. A 2004 meta-analysis attempted to analyze personality disorders in light of the five-factor personality theory and failed to find meaningful discriminations. It did find that elevated neuroticism is correlated with many personality disorders. Theories of causation. Mental noise hypothesis. Studies have found that the mean reaction times will not differ between individuals high in neuroticism and those low in neuroticism, but that with individuals high in neuroticism, there is considerably more trial-to-trial variability and performance reflected in reaction time standard deviations. In other words, on some trials, neurotic individuals are faster than average, and on others they are slower than average. It has been suggested that this variability reflects noise in the individual's information processing systems or instability of basic cognitive operations such as regulation processes, and further that this noise originates from two sources: mental preoccupations and reactivity processes. Flaming et al. 2007 studied mental noise in terms of everyday behaviors using the Cognitive Failures Questionnaire, which is a self-report measure of the frequency of slips and lapses of attention. A slip is an error by commission, and a lapse is an error by omission. This scale was correlated with two well-known measures of neuroticism, the BIS/BAS scale and the Eysenck Personality Questionnaire. Results indicated that the CFQUA Cognitive Failures Questionnaire Unintended Activation Subscale was most strongly correlated with neuroticism R equals 40 and explained the most variance 16% compared to overall CFQ scores, which only explained 7%. The authors interpret these findings as suggesting that mental noise is highly specific in nature as it is related most strongly to attention slips triggered endogenously by dissociative memory. In other words, this may suggest that mental noise is mostly task-irrelevant cognitions such as worries and preoccupations. Evolutionary psychology. The theory of evolution may also explain differences in personality. For example, one of the evolutionary approaches to depression focuses on neuroticism and finds that heightened reactivity to negative outcomes may have had a survival benefit, and that furthermore a positive relationship has been found between neuroticism level and success in university, with the precondition that the negative effects of neuroticism are also successfully coped with. Likewise, a heightened reactivity to positive events may have had reproductive advantages, selecting for heightened reactivity generally. Nettle contends that evolution selected for higher levels of neuroticism until the negative effects of neuroticism outweighed its benefits, resulting in selection for a certain optimal level of neuroticism. This type of selection will result in a normal distribution of neuroticism, so the extremities of the distribution will be individuals with excessive neuroticism or too low neuroticism for what is optimal, and the ones with excessive neuroticism would therefore be more vulnerable to the negative effects of depression, and Nettle gives this as the explanation for the existence of depression rather than hypothesizing, as others have, that depression itself has any evolutionary benefit. Some research has found that neuroticism in modern societies is positively correlated with reproductive success in females, but not in males. A possible explanation may be that neuroticism in females comes at the expense of formal education, which is correlated with lower fertility and correlates with unplanned and adolescent pregnancies. Terror management theory. According to terror management theory, TMT neuroticism is primarily caused by insufficient anxiety buffers against unconscious death anxiety. These buffers consist of cultural worldviews that impart life with a sense of enduring meaning, such as social continuity beyond one's death, future legacy, and afterlife beliefs. A sense of personal value or the self-esteem in the cultural worldview context, an enduring sense of meaning. While TMT agrees with standard evolutionary psychology accounts that the roots of neuroticism in Homo sapiens or its ancestors are likely in adaptive sensitivities to negative outcomes, it posits that once Homo sapiens achieved a higher level of self-awareness, neuroticism increased enormously, becoming largely a spandrel, a non-adaptive byproduct of our adaptive intelligence, which resulted in a crippling awareness of death that threatened to undermine other adaptive functions. This overblown anxiety thus needed to be buffered via intelligently creative, but largely fictitious and arbitrary notions of cultural meaning and personal value. Since highly religious or supernatural conceptions of the world provide cosmic personal significance and literal immortality, they are deemed to offer the most efficient buffers against death, anxiety, and neuroticism. Thus, historically, the shift to more materialistic and secular cultures starting in the Neolithic and culminating in the Industrial Revolution is deemed to have increased neuroticism.
Thank you for watching. Consider supporting the channel, leave a like and subscribe.